The marble floors of the Levi estate gleamed like mirrors under the Milanese autumn sun, each footstep I took echoing through corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity. My second-hand shoes, practical flats I'd worn to 3 previous job interviews, felt inadequate against such opulence. But I'd learned long ago that survival meant showing up regardless of how out of place you felt. "Miss Renata, Signor Levi will see you in his study." Samuel, the driver who'd collected me from the train station, announced with the practiced formality of someone who'd mastered the art of respectful distance. His salt-and-pepper hair was impeccably groomed, his dark suit pressed to perfection, and his eyes, kind, I noticed, held a wariness that spoke of years serving a man whose reputation preceded him. I followed him through a gallery lined with Renaissance paintings that belonged in museums, not private homes. The scent of beeswax and something darker, expensive leather, perhaps, or aged wood, permeated the air. My teaching degree suddenly felt laughably inadequate. What did I know about caring for the daughter of Matteo Levi, whose name was whispered with equal parts reverence and terror throughout Milan? The study door was heavy oak, carved with intricate patterns that my fingers itched to trace. Samuel knocked twice, received a curt "Avanti" from within, and gestured for me to enter. Matteo Levi sat behind a desk that could have accommodated a small dinner party, his attention fixed on a laptop screen. He didn't look up immediately, and I used those suspended seconds to observe him with the analytical eye I'd developed after years of reading students' micro-expressions. Mid-30s, I estimated. Dark hair swept back with the kind of casual precision that suggested both expense and indifference to it. The white dress shirt he wore was unbuttoned at the collar, not carelessly but deliberately, as if he'd shed formality the moment business hours ended. His jawline was sharp enough to cut glass, his hands long-fingered and elegant as they moved across the keyboard with surprising delicacy for a man rumored to break bones with those same fingers. When he finally looked up, his eyes were the color of espresso, dark, intense, utterly unreadable. They swept over me with the efficiency of a security checkpoint, cataloging and dismissing in the same breath. "Renata Cardoso," he said, my name flavored with a slight accent that softened the R. 25. Bachelor's in Early Childhood Education from the University of Padua. 3 years teaching kindergarten at Scuola Primaria San Marco. He recited my credentials from memory, never glancing at the papers before him. References describe you as dedicated, patient, and fiercely protective of your students. The headmaster noted you once physically intervened when a parent became aggressive during a conference. Heat crept up my neck. That incident had cost me a formal reprimand, though the parent, a stockbroker who thought his money entitled him to verbally abuse a 5-year-old, had been escorted off premises by security. The child needed protection, I said simply, meeting his gaze with the same steady calm I'd used to face down that furious father. His well-being mattered more than protocol. Something flickered in Matteo's expression. Approval, perhaps, or calculation. With a man like him, it was impossible to tell. "My daughter Sophia is 5 years old," he said, standing abruptly. He moved around the desk with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in his own body, comfortable with power. "Her mother died 2 years ago. Complications from pneumonia that the doctors assured us was minor until it wasn't." The grief that crossed his face was there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. Except I'd seen that particular expression before. In the mirror, after my own mother's sudden death when I was Sophia's age. "I work significant hours," he continued, stopping near the window that overlooked gardens so meticulously maintained they looked like paintings. "My business requires travel, late nights, early mornings. Sophia needs consistency, structure, someone who won't leave when the hours prove difficult or the compensation insufficient." His eyes found mine again. The previous nanny lasted 3 weeks. The one before her, 10 days. The one before that quit after Sophia threw a tantrum in the middle of a dinner party I was hosting for business associates. I absorbed this information, my teacher's instinct immediately recognizing the pattern. A 5-year-old who's lost her mother and rarely sees her father will test boundaries, I said carefully. She's checking if the adults in her life will abandon her like her mother did. Not intentionally, obviously. But from a child's perspective, death and abandonment feel identical. Mateo's eyebrows rose fractionally. You psychoanalyze children, Miss Cardoso? I teach them, I corrected. Which requires understanding why they behave as they do. Sophia isn't being difficult. She's being traumatized. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the antique clock on the mantelpiece ticking. I'd overstepped, I realized too late. One didn't lecture Mateo Levi about anything, least of all his own daughter. But instead of the dismissal I expected, he nodded slowly. You'll start tomorrow. Samuel will collect you at 7. Your quarters are in the West Wing. Private suite with sitting room and bath. Salary is twice what you made teaching, plus room and board. You'll have Sundays free unless I'm traveling, in which case you'll receive compensatory time off. He paused. One rule. Sophia's well-being comes first. Before household protocol, before staff hierarchy, before my convenience. If you believe she needs something, you come to me directly. Is that understood? It was the most generous employment offer I'd ever received, wrapped in the most dangerous package imaginable. Working for Mateo Levi meant entering a world I'd only read about in newspapers, a world where power was absolute and consequences were permanent. But beneath his carefully maintained control, I'd glimpsed something unexpected. A father who knew he was failing his daughter and hated himself for it. Understood, I said. Marta will show you to your rooms and introduce you to Sophia. He returned to his desk, his attention already shifting back to whatever business demanded it. Then, almost as an afterthought, Miss Cardoso? Thank you for accepting the position. You'll find that loyalty to my family is rewarded generously. The unspoken corollary hung in the air between us. Disloyalty would be punished with equal generosity. Samuel escorted me to the West Wing, where a woman in her late 50s waited with the rigid posture of a military general. Marta's steel-gray hair was pulled into a bun so severe it seemed to stretch her already thin lips thinner. Her black dress was immaculate, her shoes polished to a mirror shine, and her eyes, cold, assessing, dismissed me before I'd even been introduced. So you're the new nanny, she said in Italian, her tone making it clear she gave me the same 3 weeks the previous one had lasted. I run this household, Miss Cardoso. Meals are served at precise times, noise is kept to a minimum, and Signor Levi's business is never, under any circumstances, discussed or questioned. The child is to be kept clean, quiet, and out of sight when Signor Levi has guests. Is that clear? The child, not Sophia. Not the little girl who'd lost her mother and rarely saw her father. The child, as if she were a problem to be managed rather than a human being to be nurtured. Perfectly clear, I said, matching her Italian with the fluency I'd developed during university. Now, may I meet Sophia? Marta's nostrils flared slightly, the only indication that my calm response had irritated her. She's in the nursery, 3rd floor, East Wing. Nomi will bring her dinner at 6 precisely. She's to be in bed by 8, no exceptions. I'd prefer to eat with her, I said. Children Sophia's age need social interaction during meals. That, Marta said coldly, is not how this household operates. We stared at each other, 2 women separated by age, experience, and philosophy, united only by our employment under the same roof. I was 25, newly hired, completely out of my depth. She was the established authority, confident in her domain. But I'd meant what I said to Mateo. Sophia's well-being came first. Then perhaps, I said quietly, it's time this household's operations changed. The nursery was a contradiction that broke my heart. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked gardens designed for playing, yet the room itself felt like a museum exhibit. Pristine, untouched, devoid of the cheerful chaos that should define a 5-year-old's space. Toys lined shelves with military precision, their arrangement too perfect to have been played with recently. A canopy bed draped in white lace dominated one corner, its covers smooth and unwrinkled. The only sign of actual life was a worn stuffed rabbit tucked against the pillows, its fur matted from countless nights of being held. Sophia sat at a small table near the window, coloring with the mechanical precision of someone performing a chore rather than enjoying creativity. She didn't look up when I entered, though her crayon hesitated fractionally. Awareness without acknowledgement. "Hello, Sophia," I said, keeping my voice gentle as I approached. "My name is Renata. I'm going to be staying here with you." She continued coloring, filling in a princess's dress with careful strokes that stayed meticulously within the lines. Her dark hair, so like her father's, was pulled into 2 perfect braids that must have taken significant time to achieve. Her dress was expensive, spotless, and utterly impractical for a child. She looked like a doll positioned for display. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, not forcing interaction, but making myself available. Years of teaching had taught me that children, especially traumatized ones, needed to approach connection on their own terms. "That's beautiful work," I observed, watching her add shading to the dress. "You're very good at staying in the lines." "Marta says messy coloring is for common children," Sophia replied, her voice small and eerily mature. "Levi children are never messy." The casual cruelty of that statement, delivered in a 5-year-old's voice, made my hands clench beneath the table. This wasn't a child. This was a miniature adult, shaped by expectations no kindergartner should carry. "You know what I think?" I leaned forward conspiratorially. "I think the best art happens when you forget about lines entirely. Want to see?" For the first time, Sophia looked up. Her eyes, her father's eyes, dark and watchful, held a wariness that no child should possess. "Marta will be angry if I make a mess." "Marta doesn't have to know," I said, pulling out a fresh piece of paper from the stack. "This can be our secret, just between us." I selected a purple crayon and drew a wild, swooping line across the page, deliberately chaotic, gloriously free. Sophia watched with the intensity of someone witnessing a minor rebellion, her crayon hovering forgotten above her princess. "Your turn," I encouraged, offering her a green crayon. She took it with trembling fingers, glanced toward the door as if expecting Marta to materialize, then drew a single tiny squiggle. It was barely visible, more suggestion than statement, but triumph blazed across her small face. "Again," I said, bigger this time. The second line was bolder, the third bolder still. By the 10th, Sophia was giggling, a sound so unexpected and pure that it transformed her entirely. This was the child beneath the porcelain doll exterior, the little girl who'd been buried under rules and expectations, and the terrible weight of being Matteo Levi's daughter. We were creating a spectacularly messy, abstract masterpiece when Nomi appeared with dinner, a tiny portion of steamed vegetables and plain chicken, arranged on china that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "Signorina Sophia," Nomi said, her voice carrying the same careful neutrality Samuel's had. "Your dinner." "Thank you, Nomi," I said, noting how the older woman's eyes widened slightly at being addressed directly. "Would you mind bringing another plate? I'll be eating with Sophia tonight." Nomi's gaze darted between me and the door, calculation clear in her expression. "Marta says—" "I'm sure Marta has many opinions," I interrupted gently but firmly. "However, Signor Levi hired me to care for Sophia, and I've decided mealtimes will be shared. Unless you'd prefer I discuss this directly with him." The invocation of Matteo's authority worked like magic. Nomi nodded quickly and disappeared, returning minutes later with a second plate and portions generous enough for an adult. Sophia watched this entire exchange with wide eyes, as if witnessing something impossible. When I sat down beside her at the small table, instead of the formal dining table across the room, her shock was almost comical. "You're eating here?" she whispered. "With me?" "Of course," I said, cutting into my chicken. "Food tastes better with company, don't you think?" We ate in companionable silence, broken occasionally by Sophia's shy questions about where I'd lived before, whether I liked rabbits, she did clearly based on the stuffed one on her bed, and if I thought purple was the best color. I diplomatically suggested all colors were best at different times. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. With each minute that passed, each question answered, each moment of genuine attention given, Sophia emerged further from her shell. She was starved. Not for food, but for connection. For someone who saw her as a child, rather than an obligation. After dinner, I suggested a bath, which Sophia accepted with the resignation of someone accustomed to rigid schedules. But when I turned it into a game, seeing how many bubbles we could create, giving her plastic boats adventures across an ocean that covered the entire tub, she laughed again, that crystalline sound that seemed to physically brighten the room. I was toweling her hair when Marta appeared in the doorway, her expression carved from granite. "It's past 8 o'clock, she announced. "Sophia should have been in bed 30 minutes ago." "We were finishing her bath," I replied calmly, continuing to dry Sophia's hair with gentle efficiency. "She'll be in bed shortly." "Signor Levi's household operates on schedule," Marta said, her voice dropping to a temperature that could freeze water. "If you cannot maintain basic discipline—" "If Signor Levi has concerns about my methods," I interrupted, "I'm certain he'll discuss them with me directly, as he instructed me to come to him with any matters regarding Sophia's well-being." Marta's face flushed, a mottled red that climbed from her collar to her hairline. In her world, I'd just committed an unforgivable sin, challenging her authority while invoking her employer's name as shield. "You won't last 2 weeks, she hissed, low enough that Sophia, now climbing into her canopy bed, couldn't hear. "Girls like you never do. Too soft, too idealistic. This family will chew you up and spit you out, and I'll enjoy watching it happen." She swept from the room with the righteous fury of someone who knew, absolutely knew, that time would prove her correct. I tucked Sophia into bed, that worn rabbit clutched against her chest, and her small hand caught mine before I could pull away. "Renata," she whispered, "will you be here tomorrow?" The question pierced something in my chest. How many people had she asked that question? How many had promised yes, and then vanished like morning fog? "I'll be here," I promised, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "Every morning when you wake up, I'll be here." She smiled, tentative, fragile, but genuine, and closed her eyes. I stayed until her breathing deepened into sleep, then returned to my own quarters, where the luxury felt simultaneously excessive and isolating. The sitting room was larger than my entire previous apartment. The bathroom featured a soaking tub and rainfall shower. The bedroom had a mattress so soft I briefly worried I'd sink through to the floor. But comfort couldn't silence the warning bells now ringing in my mind. I'd been here less than 12 hours, and had already made an enemy of the woman who ran this household. Marta's threat echoed. "This family will chew you up and spit you out." I thought of Sophia's question, "Will you be here tomorrow?" and the desperate hope in her voice. I thought of Matteo's instruction. Sophia's well-being comes first, and I realized with crystalline clarity that surviving in this house would require more than patience and teaching skills. It would require choosing sides in a war I didn't fully understand yet, between the rigid protocol Marta enforced and the desperate need of a little girl who'd been treated like an inconvenience in her own home. I'd promised Sophia I'd be here tomorrow. Whatever that required, I'd find a way to keep that promise. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt both natural and dangerous. Each morning, I woke to Sophia's small knock on my door, tentative at first, then increasingly confident as she learned I actually meant it when I said I'd be there. We'd have breakfast together in the nursery, her chatter growing more animated with each passing day, the porcelain doll facade cracking to reveal the vibrant child beneath. But my presence had created fault lines throughout the household. Marta's disapproval radiated like heat from summer pavement, her instructions increasingly pointed, her observations of my methods shared in tones that dripped disdain. Nomi remained carefully neutral, bringing meals with the precise timing Marta demanded, while occasionally sneaking Sophia an extra biscuit when she thought no one was watching. Samuel, I discovered, was an ally, his kind eyes crinkling when he witnessed Sophia's laughter, his subtle nods of approval when I advocated for changes to her schedule. Matteo himself remained an enigma. I saw him rarely, glimpses in corridors as he left for business or returned in the small hours. Twice I'd encountered him in the early morning, disheveled in a way that suggested he'd worked through the night. His dress shirt rumpled, shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of burdens I couldn't imagine. Both times he'd asked about Sophia with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the simple questions: how she slept, what she ate, whether she seemed happy. "She's thriving," I'd told him truthfully. "But she misses you." His expression had shuttered immediately, walls slamming into place. "My schedule doesn't permit." "She's 5, I'd interrupted gently. "She doesn't understand schedules. She only understands that her father is here but never with her." He'd walked away without responding, but the next evening, he'd appeared at dinner. Sophia's shock had transformed into incandescent joy, her entire body vibrating with excitement as she showed him the drawings we'd made, the stories we'd read, the elaborate castle we'd built from blocks. Matteo had listened with an attention that seemed to physically hurt him, as if witnessing his daughter's happiness was both gift and punishment. When Sophia had thrown her arms around his neck in a spontaneous hug, I'd seen something crack in his carefully maintained control, grief so raw and profound that I'd quietly excused myself to give them privacy. That night, standing in my quarters, I'd heard Sophia's laughter echoing through the halls, accompanied by Matteo's deeper voice reading her bedtime story. The sound had wrapped around my heart like a fist, squeezing until I could barely breathe. This was what I'd come here to facilitate, reconnecting a broken family. But I hadn't anticipated how witnessing that reconnection would affect me. Hadn't prepared for the way Matteo's rare smiles, earned through Sophia's antics, would lodge themselves in my memory. Hadn't expected the warmth that flooded my chest when he'd looked up from the storybook to find me watching from the doorway, his expression transforming from guarded to something softer, more vulnerable. "Thank you," he'd mouth silently, and I'd nodded, retreating before the moment could mean more than it should. But everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon when Sophia and I returned from the gardens, our hands dirty from planting bulbs that would bloom in spring. She was chattering about butterflies and rainbows, her imagination finally free to soar, when we encountered Marta in the main hall. "Look what we planted," Sophia announced, holding up her muddy hands with pride. "Renata says there'll be tulips when—" "You're filthy," Marta cut her off, disgust clear in every syllable. "Tracking dirt through Senior Levi's home like a common street child. This is exactly what happens when discipline is abandoned for foolish indulgence." Sophia's face crumpled, joy extinguished like a candle in wind. Her hands dropped to her sides, muddy fingers curling into small fists as she stared at the marble floor. "We were gardening," I said, keeping my voice level despite the fury building in my chest. "Children should be allowed to play outside and get dirty. It's healthy." "Children of this household," Marta said icily, "are expected to maintain standards. Or have you forgotten where you are, Miss Cardoso? This isn't some public school where mediocrity is celebrated. Sophia is a Levi. She has a legacy to uphold, a reputation to maintain. Your peasant attitudes. Enough. The word cracked through the air like a gunshot. Matteo stood at the top of the stairs, his presence filling the space with an authority that made even Marta hesitate. He descended slowly, each step deliberate, his expression carved from stone. "Papa," Sophia whispered, shrinking against my legs. Something in that single word, the fear in her voice, the instinctive retreat, made Matteo's jaw tighten. His gaze moved from Marta to Sophia to me, cataloging the scene with the sharp intelligence I'd glimpsed during my interview. "Marta," he said quietly, "you're dismissed for the day." "Signor Levi, I was merely maintaining—" "I said you're dismissed." His voice dropped to a register that made the temperature plummet. "Now." Marta's face flushed with humiliation, but she left, her footsteps echoing like gunshots against marble. The silence that followed pressed against my eardrums. Sophia remained frozen against me, and I felt the trembling in her small body, saw the way her muddy fingers clutched at my skirt. Matteo's attention fixed on his daughter, and for a moment, I saw past the feared Mafia boss to the father who'd lost his wife and was terrified of failing his child. "Sophia," he said, kneeling so they were eye level. "Show me what you planted." Her head snapped up, confusion replacing fear. "But I'm dirty." "Show me," he repeated gently, extending his hand. Hesitantly, Sophia placed her muddy palm in his immaculate one. Together, they walked to the gardens, and I followed at a respectful distance, watching as Matteo listened to his daughter describe each bulb, each potential flower, her enthusiasm gradually returning as she realized he genuinely wanted to hear. "Renata says we can make a rainbow," Sophia explained, pointing to where we'd arranged the bulbs by color. "Red tulips here, then orange, then yellow, all the way to purple, and in spring, it'll be like the garden is wearing a rainbow." "That sounds beautiful, Piccola," Matteo murmured, and the tenderness in his voice made my throat tight. "Will you show me when they bloom?" "You'll be here?" Sophia asked, the same desperate hope I'd heard that first night threading through her words. "In spring?" "I'll be here," he promised, pulling her close despite her muddy state. "I promise, amore mio." That evening, after Sophia was bathed and sleeping, I found Matteo in his study, staring at nothing. "Come in, Renata," he said without turning. "I assume you have thoughts about this afternoon." I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. Marta has been undermining Sophia's confidence since I arrived. Today was just the first time you witnessed it. "How long?" His voice was dangerously soft. "I don't know how long before I came. But these past 3 weeks, constantly. Small corrections, criticisms disguised as guidance, comparisons to some impossible standard of perfection." I moved closer, needing him to understand. "Sophia is 5 years old. She should be playing, exploring, making messes. Instead, she's been taught that being a child is somehow shameful, that joy is undignified, that she's only valuable when she's invisible." Matteo's hands clenched on the desk. "I hired Marta after Julia died. I needed someone efficient, someone who could maintain the household while I—" He stopped, jaw working. "I failed her, my own daughter, and I failed to see what was happening in my own home." "You were grieving," I said quietly, "and running an empire. You trusted the wrong person, but you're seeing the truth now. That's what matters." He finally turned to face me, and the vulnerability in his expression stole my breath. "She's afraid of me. My own daughter flinches when I enter a room. How did I let it get this far?" "She's not afraid of you," I corrected. "She's afraid of disappointing you. There's a difference." Because Marta taught her that disappointing me would have consequences. His voice hardened. "She's fired, effective immediately." "Matteo." I should have done it the moment you challenged her authority over dinner schedules, he continued. I saw the battle lines being drawn, and I stayed out of it because it was easier than acknowledging that my household had become a prison for my daughter. He moved around the desk, stopping close enough that I caught his scent, sandalwood and something crisp, like winter air. You kept your promise to her. Every morning, you were there, exactly as you said you'd be. You fought for her when I wasn't paying attention. You made her laugh again. His eyes searched mine. Why? Because she deserved someone in her corner, I said simply. Because every child deserves to feel safe and loved and valued for who they are, not who they're expected to become. And you? The question was almost a whisper. Do you feel safe here, Renata? The shift in conversation caught me off guard. Yes, of course. You challenged Marta knowing it could cost you this position. You defied household protocol from day one. You argue with me about my daughter's needs without fear. A slight smile curved his lips. Either you're remarkably brave or remarkably foolish. Maybe both, I admitted, returning his smile despite the tension crackling between us. We stood in that charged silence, the space between us feeling simultaneously too vast and not nearly vast enough. I was acutely aware of how his shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle. How his hair had fallen across his forehead, softening the harsh angles of his face. How he was looking at me not as an employee but as a woman who'd somehow become essential to his daughter's well-being, and possibly to his own. Renata, he said finally, I have a business dinner tomorrow night. Important associates from Rome. Would you... He hesitated, a crack in his usual confidence. Would you join us? Not as Sophia's nanny, but as my guest. The invitation hung between us, weighted with implications I wasn't certain I understood. I don't think that's appropriate, I managed. Appropriate, he repeated, something dangerous glinting in his eyes. Since when have you been concerned with what's appropriate, Kara? He was right. I'd been breaking unspoken rules since I arrived. What was one more? What time should I be ready? I asked. His smile was slow, devastating, and entirely too knowing. 7 o'clock. Wear something beautiful. I want them to see exactly what I see when I look at you. And before I could ask what that meant, he'd already turned back to his desk, dismissing me with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having the last word. The dress appeared in my quarters the following afternoon, delivered by Samuel with the discretion of someone who'd performed similar tasks countless times. Deep emerald silk that shimmered like water, elegant without being ostentatious, the neckline modest but the cut unmistakably designed to enhance rather than conceal. A note accompanied it in Matteo's precise handwriting. To match your eyes when you argue with me. Emma held the dress against myself, watching the silk catch the light, and tried to ignore the dangerous warmth spreading through my chest. This was inappropriate on multiple levels. I was his employee. More significantly, I was his daughter's nanny, a position built on trust and professional boundaries that gifts like this obliterated. But I was also a woman who hadn't felt beautiful in longer than I cared to admit. And the thought of Matteo seeing me in this dress made my pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with professional responsibility. I wore it. The dinner guests arrived precisely at 7. 3 men in expensive suits accompanied by women who wore their wealth like armor, dripping in jewelry that probably cost more than my previous annual salary. I recognized one of the men from newspapers, Alessandro Romano, real estate magnate with rumored connections to every corrupt politician in Rome. Matteo met me at the top of the stairs, and the way his gaze traveled over me, slow, appreciative, possessive, made my breath catch. Bellissima, he murmured, offering his arm. They won't be able to concentrate on business, which serves them right for boring me with it. The dinner was elaborate. courses appearing with choreographed precision, while conversation flowed around topics I barely understood. Property developments, agreements with city officials, timetables that seemed to have nothing to do with construction. I remained mostly silent, observing the power dynamics at play. These men deferred to Matteo with the careful respect reserved for those who could destroy them. Their wives assessed me with calculating eyes, trying to determine my place in Matteo's hierarchy. His mistress? Future wife? Irrelevant decoration? Miss Cardoso, Alessandro said during the third course, his smile not reaching his eyes. Matteo mentioned you're Sophia's nanny. Tell me, how does a kindergarten teacher from Padua end up working for the Levi family? The question was barbed with implied dismissal. I set down my fork with deliberate care. I answered an advertisement for a position requiring patience, dedication, and the ability to prioritize a child's needs above all else, I replied evenly. Skills developed through education and experience, regardless of where that education was obtained. Of course, Alessandro's wife interjected, her diamonds catching the candlelight. Though I imagine the compensation here is significantly better than public school teaching. The compensation, I said, meeting her gaze directly, is watching a traumatized child rediscover joy. The salary is secondary. Silence fell around the table. I'd just implied that money, the god these people worshipped, meant less to me than emotional fulfillment. In their world, such a statement was either noble or insane. Matteo's hand found mine under the table, squeezing briefly. Approval or warning, I couldn't tell. Renata has revolutionized my household in 3 weeks, he said, his voice carrying the casual authority that ended debates. Sophia has transformed under her care. I consider myself fortunate that she accepted the position. The conversation shifted to safer topics, but I felt eyes on me throughout the meal, assessing, calculating, wondering what I really was to Matteo Levi. After dinner, while the men retreated for cognac and cigars, the wives gathered in the salon, and I found myself trapped in a conversation about charity galas and designer trunk shows. I was searching for a polite exit when a commotion erupted from upstairs. Sophia's scream cut through the house like a blade. I was running before conscious thought registered, taking stairs 2 at a time, vaguely aware of Matteo's presence behind me. Sophia's door stood open, revealing Marta, who I'd been told was dismissed, standing over Sophia's bed while my charge cowered against the headboard, tears streaming down her face. "You're a spoiled, ungrateful child," Marta was hissing. "Your mother would be ashamed of what you've become. All this playing in dirt and making messes like a common... Get away from her." My voice emerged cold, deadly calm, as I crossed the room and positioned myself between Marta and Sophia. "Now." "You have no authority here," Marta spat. "Signor Levi will see sense eventually, and when he does, you'll be gone, and I'll..." "Touch my daughter again," Matteo said from the doorway, his voice dropping to a register that froze everyone in place. "And I'll ensure you never work in Milano again. In fact, you'll be fortunate if employment is your only concern." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the casual certainty of someone who'd followed through on worse. Marta's face drained of color. I was only trying to maintain standards. "You were terrorizing a 5-year-old child," I cut in, no longer caring about consequences. "In her own bedroom, after being explicitly dismissed from this household. That's not maintaining standards. That's cruelty. How dare you speak to me?" "Security," Matteo said into his phone, not raising his voice. "Remove Marta Santini from the premises, immediately, and ensure she understands that she's never to return or contact anyone in this household again." 2 men in dark suits materialized within seconds, efficiency suggesting they'd been waiting nearby. Marta was escorted out, her protests fading as she was removed from the house. Only then did I turn to Sophia, who'd pressed herself against the headboard, her small body trembling. I sat on the edge of the bed, opening my arms, and she launched herself into them, sobbing against my shoulder. "She said you were leaving," Sophia choked out. "She said Papa would send you away because you don't belong here, and I'd be alone again. And I'm not leaving," I promised fiercely, holding her close. "I'm not going anywhere, Tesoro." "Promise?" Her voice was so small, so desperate. "I promise." Matteo knelt beside the bed, his hand gentle on Sophia's back. "Sophia, amore mio, Renata stays as long as she wants to stay. No one will send her away. You have my word." Sophia lifted her tear-stained face. "Really? Really?" He met my eyes over her head, and something in his gaze made my breath catch. Renata is family now, and family stays. The weight of that statement settled over me like a blanket, warm and suffocating simultaneously. I'd crossed a line tonight, from employee to something else, something undefined but undeniably permanent. Later, after Sophia finally slept and the dinner guests had been politely dismissed with apologies, I found Matteo in his study, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. "You called her your daughter," I said from the doorway. "When you threatened Marta, you said my daughter, not Sophia." "She is my daughter." He looked up, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "I've spent 2 years trying to protect her by maintaining distance, thinking that if I didn't get too close, losing me wouldn't destroy her the way losing Julia did." His laugh was bitter. "Instead, I created a different kind of loss. She was living in my house, but had already lost me through my own cowardice." "You're not a coward," I said, moving into the room. "You're a father who lost his wife and didn't know how to be both parents." "I have people killed, Renata." The blunt statement hung between us. "People who cross me, who threaten what's mine. I've built an empire on fear and blood, but I couldn't handle being a father to my own child. Because being a father requires vulnerability," I said quietly. "And vulnerability is dangerous in your world. In my world, vulnerability gets you killed." He stood, moving toward me with that predatory grace. "But you walked into my home and demonstrated vulnerability every single day. You fought for Sophia when it could have cost you everything. You challenged Marta, challenged me, challenged every assumption this household operated under. Why? Because it was right." I held his gaze. "Because Sophia deserved someone who saw her as a child, not an obligation or a symbol. And me?" His voice dropped. "What do you see when you look at me?" The question stripped away all pretense. We stood in his study, the rest of the house quiet, the night pressing against windows like a living thing. "I see a man who's terrified of loving his daughter because love makes you vulnerable to loss," I said. "I see someone who's spent 2 years in survival mode, protecting everyone except himself. I see—" "What, Kara?" He was close now, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "What else do you see?" "A father who's trying," I whispered. "Someone who's capable of change, who wants to be better for his daughter." "Just for Sophia?" His hand rose to cup my cheek, thumb tracing my cheekbone. "Or perhaps for someone else as well?" The touch ignited something dangerous between us, recognition of attraction we'd both been carefully ignoring. Professional boundaries dissolved like sugar in water. "Matteo." "You promised her you weren't leaving," he said softly. "I'm holding you to that, Renata. Not as an employer, but as a man who's discovered that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what you need most." Before I could decipher that cryptic statement, he'd stepped back, the moment broken, but its implications still crackling in the air between us. "Get some rest," he said, his voice rough. "Tomorrow we start over. New rules, new household, new beginning." As I returned to my quarters, my cheek still warm from his touch, I understood that everything had changed tonight. I was no longer just Sophia's nanny. I'd become something far more dangerous. Someone Matteo Levi cared about protecting. The weeks following Marta's expulsion transformed the Levi household. Matteo hired Nomi's niece, Gabriella, as the new head of household, a woman in her 40s whose warmth and competence created an atmosphere so different from Marta's reign that Sophia blossomed like flowers after rain. More significantly, Matteo restructured his schedule. Mornings now included breakfast with Sophia in the sunroom, where he'd listen to her chatter about dreams and butterflies while reviewing business documents. Evenings meant dinner together, the three of us developing rhythms that felt dangerously close to actual family. I watched them reconnect with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal longing. The way Matteo's entire demeanor softened when Sophia climbed into his lap to show him drawings, how he'd started checking her room each night before his own sleep, tucking her forgotten rabbit closer. The careful questions he'd ask me about her development, her fears, her needs. A father desperate to understand the daughter he'd almost lost to his own grief. But beneath the domestic warmth, darkness still threaded through the household. Meetings happened behind closed doors. Visitors arrived at odd hours, and sometimes Matteo would emerge from his study with blood on his knuckles and shadows in his eyes that no amount of Sophia's laughter could quite dispel. I pretended not to notice, maintained the fiction that I worked for a normal, if wealthy, businessman, that the men who guarded the estate were simply security, that the hushed phone conversations in Italian dialects I didn't recognize were merely business as usual, until the night everything unraveled. It was late, past midnight, and I'd been reading in my quarters when Sophia's scream shattered the silence. I ran to her room to find it empty, her bed covers thrown back, her stuffed rabbit abandoned on the floor. Panic clawed up my throat as I raced into the hallway, calling her name. Samuel appeared from seemingly nowhere, his expression grim. "The East Wing," he said tersely, quickly. I followed him through corridors I rarely traveled, to a part of the house that belonged exclusively to Matteo, his private office, his sanctuary. The door stood open, revealing a scene that made my blood freeze. 3 men in dark suits, not Matteo's people, I knew instinctively, stood near his desk. One held Sophia, his hand clamped over her mouth, her terrified eyes finding mine immediately. Matteo stood perfectly still, hands raised in surrender, his gaze locked on his daughter with an intensity that radiated lethal intent, barely leashed. "Let her go," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Your quarrel is with me, Alessandro. The child is innocent." Alessandro Romano, the real estate magnate from the dinner weeks ago, stood by the window, smiling with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally found leverage. "Innocent?" Alessandro laughed. "She's a Levi. There's no such thing as innocent in our world, Matteo. You taught me that when you killed my brother." The casual revelation of murder, stated like commenting on weather, should have shocked me. Instead, I found myself calculating distances, angles, trying to determine how to reach Sophia. "Your brother betrayed me," Matteo said flatly. "He knew the consequences. As you know the consequences of refusing my very generous offer for your shipping operations." Alessandro's smile widened. "Sign the transfer documents, Matteo, or I take something precious from you, as you took from me." The man holding Sophia shifted his grip, and she whimpered, a sound so small and terrified that something primal ignited in my chest. "Don't," I said, stepping fully into the room. "Don't hurt her." All eyes turned to me. Alessandro's calculating, his men's dismissive, Matteo's desperate. "Ah, the nanny," Alessandro observed. "The woman who's transformed the great Matteo Levi into something almost human. How touching." His gaze sharpened. "Perhaps we don't need the child after all. Perhaps we take what he actually values. You take neither. Matteo's voice cut like a blade. Put Sophia down. Leave this house and I'll consider your offer. Consider? Alessandro's laugh was ugly. You're not in a position to consider anything. You sign those documents now, or I hurt someone you love. Your choice which one. The calculation in his eyes as he looked between Sophia and me made my skin crawl. He'd identified us both as leverage, pressure points to exploit. Matteo's gaze found mine across the room, and in that moment, I saw past every carefully maintained wall to the truth beneath. He cared for me, not as an employee, not even as Sophia's nanny, but as a woman who'd somehow become essential to both him and his daughter. Let the child go, Matteo said quietly. Take me instead. I'll sign whatever you want, give you access to everything. Just let them both go. Papa, no, Sophia cried out, struggling against the man's grip. How noble, Alessandro sneered. But I don't think... What happened next occurred in seconds that felt like hours. The window behind Alessandro exploded inward, glass shattering as men in tactical gear swarmed into the room. Alessandro's men reached for weapons, but they were already surrounded, outmaneuvered by superior numbers and training. Sophia was torn from her captor's grip and passed to Samuel, who'd appeared from nowhere. I caught her as he handed her to me, her small body trembling violently as she buried her face against my neck. Matteo moved with lethal efficiency, his fist connecting with Alessandro's jaw before anyone could intervene. The older man crumpled, and Matteo stood over him, death in his eyes. You came into my home, he said, his voice eerily calm. Threatened my daughter. Threatened what's mine. His gaze flicked to me, to Sophia in my arms. I should kill you for that. Matteo. Samuel's quiet warning. Not here, not in front of... His eyes indicated Sophia and me. Something shifted in Matteo's expression. He straightened, his hand dropping to his side, though rage still radiated from every line of his body. Take him, he ordered his men. You know where. Alessandro was dragged from the room, his protests cut short by a blow that rendered him unconscious. The tactical team vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving broken glass and blood on marble as the only evidence of what had transpired. Matteo turned to us, and the transformation from killer to father was so immediate it would have been shocking if I hadn't witnessed it before. He crossed to where I stood holding Sophia, his hands gentle as he cupped his daughter's face. Amore mio, he murmured. You're safe now, I promise. He said he'd hurt me, Sophia sobbed. He said... He's gone. Matteo's voice hardened. He'll never threaten you again. Never. The finality in those words wasn't comfort. It was a death sentence delivered with a father's fury. Sophia reached for him, and he gathered her into his arms, holding her with a desperation that made my throat tight. Over her head, his eyes found mine, dark and haunted. Take her to your room, he said quietly. Stay with her tonight. I need... He stopped, jaw working. I need to know you're both safe. I nodded, understanding the unspoken request. He needed to handle Alessandro, needed to do whatever dark business his world required, without his daughter or me witnessing it. Come on, Tesoro, I murmured to Sophia, gently extracting her from Matteo's embrace. Let's get you somewhere safe. She clung to me as I carried her to my quarters, her sobs gradually quieting to hiccups, and then to exhausted breathing. I tucked her into my bed, lying beside her, keeping watch as her eyes finally closed in fitful sleep. Hours later, near dawn, my door opened silently. Matteo stood in the doorway, still dressed but with blood spattered on his shirt. He didn't enter, just stood there looking at Sophia sleeping peacefully, at me watching over her. Is he... I began. Don't ask questions you don't want answers to, he interrupted softly. Then quieter. She's safe. You both are. That's all that matters. He started to leave, but my voice stopped him. Matteo. He turned back, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. Thank you, I said, for protecting her, for protecting us. Something in his expression cracked. You don't thank someone for protecting what they love, Renata. You just accept that they'll burn the world down before they let harm come to it. Before I could respond, he was gone, leaving me with Sophia's sleeping form and the terrifying realization that I'd become integral to Matteo Levy's world in ways I could never escape. Not as an employee, not even as his daughter's nanny, but as someone he'd killed to protect. And perhaps already had. The morning after Alessandro's intrusion dawned gray and cold, Milan's autumn rain tapping against windows like ghostly fingers. Sophia refused to leave my side, her small hand clutching mine with desperate strength as we navigated breakfast in the sunroom. Matteo appeared looking haunted, shadows beneath his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept, and the careful way he moved indicating injuries he was concealing. He knelt beside Sophia's chair, his hand gentle on her hair. Piccola, he said softly. I need to leave for a few days. Business in Rome that can't wait. Her face crumpled. You're going away. Only for 3 days, he promised, then looked at me. Renata will be here, and I'm leaving additional security. Samuel will be in charge. You'll be safe. The emphasis on safe carried weight beyond normal reassurance. He was fortifying his home, preparing for potential retaliation, ensuring that what had happened last night could never happen again. When do you leave? I asked. This afternoon. He stood, his hand finding my shoulder, squeezing gently. We need to talk before I go. My study, after Sophia's settled with her lessons? I nodded, watching him leave with the terrible understanding that our relationship had crossed another invisible line last night. I wasn't just Sophia's nanny anymore. I was someone Matteo was protecting, prioritizing, keeping safe in ways that had nothing to do with employment. 2 hours later, I stood in his study while he poured coffee with mechanical precision. Alessandro won't be a problem anymore, he said without preamble. His business interests have been redistributed. His associates have been made aware that any retaliation would be unwise. The careful euphemisms couldn't disguise the truth. He'd destroyed a man for threatening his daughter, for threatening me. Matteo, I know what you're going to say. He set down his cup, turning to face me. That I went too far. That violence isn't the answer. That there must have been another way. Actually, I said quietly, I was going to say thank you. He blinked, clearly expecting different words. You protected Sophia, I continued. You protected me. In your world, with your rules, you did what you had to do. I'm not naive enough to judge you for that anymore. You should be horrified, he said, something desperate in his voice. You should take Sophia and run as far from me as possible. I'm a monster, Renata. I've killed men, destroyed lives, built an empire on fear and blood. Last night proved you're a father who loves his daughter, I interrupted. Everything else is just context. We stared at each other across his study, the truth hanging between us like smoke. I'm falling in love with you, he said, the words rough and unexpected. I've been falling since you challenged Marta over dinner schedules, since you promised Sophia you'd be there every morning, since you looked at me and saw a father instead of a monster. My breath caught. Matteo. I know I have no right. He moved closer, not touching but near enough that I felt his warmth. I know you came here to care for Sophia, not to become entangled with her father. I know my world is dangerous and dark and everything you should run from. His hand rose to cup my face, thumb tracing my cheekbone. But I'm selfish enough to hope you might choose to stay anyway. This is insane, I whispered, even as I leaned into his touch. I'm your employee, your daughter's nanny. This crosses every professional boundary. Then stop being my employee. His voice dropped. Be my partner, my equal, the woman I come home to, the one who makes my daughter laugh, who makes me want to be better than I am. I don't know if I can handle your world, I admitted. Last night terrified me. It terrified me too, he said. The thought of losing either of you. His jaw tightened. I've lost one woman I loved. I can't survive losing two more. The admission hung between us, raw and vulnerable. Matteo Levi, feared throughout Milan, was standing before me with his heart in his hands, offering me a choice that would define both our futures. If I stay, I said carefully, it's not as your employee, it's as myself, with my own voice, my own opinions, my own agency. I wouldn't want you any other way, Cara. And Sophia comes first, always. Before your business, before your empire, before everything. She already does. His smile was slight but genuine. You taught me that. I looked at this man, this dangerous, powerful, devastatingly complicated man, and saw the truth beneath every carefully constructed wall. He was terrified of love because love made you vulnerable. But he was offering it anyway, placing himself at my mercy in ways he'd never done with anyone else. I'm not promising forever, I said. I'm promising today, and tomorrow, and we'll see where that leads. His relief was palpable. That's enough. More than enough. When his lips met mine, it felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff simultaneously. Safety and danger intertwined so thoroughly I couldn't distinguish between them. His hands were gentle despite their strength, his kiss careful, despite the hunger I felt radiating from him. We broke apart at Sophia's voice calling from the hallway. Later, Matteo promised, pressing a final kiss to my forehead. When I return from Rome, we'll figure out what this means. For now, I'll keep Sophia safe, I finished. And you'll come home to us. Us, he repeated, testing the word. I like the sound of that. The 3 days he was gone stretched like weeks. Sophia and I maintained our routines, but the house felt different without Matteo's presence. Emptier, despite the increased security Samuel had implemented. Guards patrolled the perimeter. Cameras monitored every entrance. We were safer than ever, yet I found myself watching the driveway obsessively, waiting for Matteo's return. He arrived on the third evening, exhausted but whole, and Sophia's shriek of joy as she launched herself into his arms made my chest tight. You came back, she exclaimed. You promised and you came back. I'll always come back to you, amore mio, he murmured against her hair, his eyes finding mine over her head. Always. That night, after Sophia was asleep, we sat together in the garden, and Matteo told me his plans. I'm restructuring my operations, he said, legitimizing where I can, separating myself from the more dangerous aspects. It will take time, but I want Sophia to inherit something she can be proud of. He paused. And I want you to stay knowing that I'm trying to be better. You're already better, I said, taking his hand. You're a father who loves his daughter. Everything else is just details. His smile was soft, grateful, and utterly transformative. Stay with us, Renata, not as an employee, as family. I thought of the scared, lonely woman who'd arrived at this mansion months ago, desperate for work and security, of the little girl who'd been treated as an obligation rather than a child, of the man who'd been drowning in grief and guilt, convinced he was failing at the one thing that mattered most. We'd found each other in the wreckage of broken lives and built something new. Fragile, perhaps, but genuine. "Yes," I said simply. "I'll stay." Matteo pulled me close, pressing a kiss to my temple, and in that moment, surrounded by gardens and guards and the distant sounds of Milan at night, I understood something crucial. Family wasn't about blood or legal contracts or conventional boundaries. It was about choosing to protect, to love, to show up every day even when it was terrifying. It was about promises kept and walls broken down, and second chances seized despite the cost. It was about a little girl who finally had two parents who loved her, and two adults who'd discovered that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what you need most. 3 months later, Matteo asked me to marry him. Not in some grand romantic gesture, but quietly, over breakfast, with Sophia sitting between us coloring pictures of our future. I said yes before he'd even finished the question. Because somewhere between disciplining a child, defying a cruel governess, surviving an invasion, and falling in love with a man who terrified and treasured me in equal measure, I'd become part of the Levi family, and family, I'd learned, was worth fighting for. Even when, especially when, the fight required crossing lines no one expected. The engagement ring Matteo placed on my finger 3 months after his proposal was nothing like I'd imagined. No ostentatious diamond, no showy display of wealth. Instead, a delicate band of platinum held 3 stones, emerald flanked by 2 smaller diamonds, that caught the light like promises made tangible. "The emerald is Sophia's birthstone," he explained as we sat in the garden where she played nearby, her laughter floating toward us like music. "The diamonds represent us. 3 stones, 3 lives intertwined." I looked at the ring, then at him, then at the little girl who'd transformed from porcelain doll into vibrant child over these past months. "It's perfect." "You're perfect," he corrected, his thumb tracing circles on my wrist in that habitual gesture I'd grown to crave. "You saved us both, Kara. Me from becoming the monster I feared I was, and Sophia from inheriting my darkness." "You were never a monster," I said, the truth I'd learned through watching him become the father Sophia deserved. "Just a man who'd forgotten how to let people close." His smile was rueful. "I'd built such high walls, convinced myself they were protection when really they were prison bars." His gaze found Sophia, who was showing her drawings to Samuel with animated enthusiasm. "Then you arrived and demolished every wall I'd constructed, brick by stubborn brick." The wedding was planned for early summer, small, intimate, held in the garden where Sophia had first learned that getting dirty was not only acceptable, but joyful. But the months leading to it brought changes that rippled through the entire household, like stones dropped in still water. Matteo began the promised restructuring of his business operations. Meetings happened at regular hours instead of midnight summons. The men who visited wore suits from legitimate corporations, rather than carrying the barely concealed threat of violence. He was extracting himself from the darkest aspects of his empire, a process that took strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency, but left him freer than I'd ever seen him. "Alessandro's organization has been absorbed by my competitors," he told me one evening as we reviewed wedding invitations in his study. "The remaining families understand that I'm transitioning to legitimate operations. Some approve. Others—" He shrugged with the casual acceptance of someone who'd long ago stopped worrying about universal approval. "Others will adjust or find themselves isolated." "Is it dangerous?" I asked, the question I'd learned to voice rather than suppress. "This transition?" "Less dangerous than continuing as I was," he replied, his hand finding mine across the desk. "I have too much to lose now. A daughter who needs her father, a fiancé who deserves a husband she doesn't have to lie about." His eyes met mine with intensity that still made my breath catch. A future I actually want to live to see. Sophia thrived in ways that transformed her so completely, I sometimes forgot the frightened, silent child I'd first met. She started attending a small private school. Mateo's choice carefully researched to ensure she'd be challenged but nurtured, pushed, but never crushed by expectations. Her reports came back glowing. Vibrant, creative, kind to classmates, quick to defend anyone being treated unfairly. "She's like you," Mateo observed, reading over the teacher's comments about Sophia's fierce protectiveness toward a shy classmate. "Sees someone vulnerable and immediately becomes their shield." "She's like you," I corrected. "Loyal to those she loves, protective of what matters, unwilling to tolerate injustice." We were both right. Sophia was becoming herself, a blend of her father's intensity and determination, her mother's warmth that Mateo described in stories he'd finally begun sharing, and something entirely her own that had been waiting to emerge once she felt safe enough to bloom. But not everyone welcomed the changes to the Levi household. I first noticed the tension at a charity gala Mateo's business required us to attend, the kind of glittering event where Milan's elite gathered to see and be seen while writing checks that assuaged their consciences without actually changing their lives. Matteo Levi, a woman in her 60s, approached, dripping in diamonds that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. "How delightful to see you out in society again." Her gaze swept over me with the dismissive assessment I'd learned to recognize from those who measured worth in bloodlines and bank balances. "And who is your companion?" "My fiancé," Matteo said, his hand settling possessively at the small of my back. "Renata Cardoso. Renata, this is Contessa Vittoria Santoro, a longtime family friend." "How lovely," the Contessa said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "And what family are the Cardosos? I don't believe I'm familiar with the name." The question was barbed with implications, that I was nobody, that my family lacked the prestige required to marry into the Levi legacy, that my presence at Matteo's side was temporary and inappropriate. "The Cardoso family," I replied with the calm I'd perfected during months of similar interrogations, "are educators and civil servants who believed in contributing to society through service rather than inheritance. My grandmother taught in public schools for 40 years. My mother was a social worker who helped families in crisis. I consider that legacy more valuable than any title." Silence rippled outward from our conversation. Several nearby guests turned to watch, curiosity evident in their expressions. No one spoke to the Contessa that way, certainly not a former kindergarten teacher who'd arrived in the Levi household as hired help. Matteo's smile was slow, devastating, and entirely proud. "Well said, amore mio." He turned to the Contessa, his voice dropping to that dangerous register I'd learned to recognize. "Renata's family built their legacy through dedication and integrity. I consider myself fortunate that she agreed to share her life with me." The Contessa's face flushed with barely suppressed fury. She'd been dismissed publicly by a man whose favor she'd been courting for decades. "Of course," she managed, her voice brittle. "How progressive of you, Matteo." After she'd retreated, I turned to Matteo. "I just made you an enemy." "You just reminded me why I fell in love with you," he corrected. The Contessa has been positioning her granddaughter for years, hoping I'd make an advantageous marriage that would benefit her family's business interests. His eyes held mine. I chose love instead. Best decision I've ever made. But the Contessa wasn't the only one who disapproved. Over the following weeks, I noticed the subtle ways certain members of Matteo's social circle expressed their disdain. Invitations that arrived for him alone. Functions where I was included as an afterthought. Conversations that stopped when I approached. "They'll adjust," Matteo assured me after I mentioned the pattern. "Or they'll find themselves excluded from my life entirely. Your choice which bothers you more. Their disapproval or their eventual acceptance once they realize I'm not changing my mind." "Neither bothers me," I said truthfully. "I didn't agree to marry you for social acceptance. I agreed because I love you and Sophia, and I want to build a life with you both." His expression softened into something so tender it made my chest ache. "Have I mentioned recently that you're extraordinary?" "Not in the last few hours," I teased. I was starting to worry. He pulled me close, his lips finding mine in a kiss that still had the power to make my knees weak despite months of such kisses. When we broke apart, both breathing harder, his forehead rested against mine. "After we're married," he murmured, "I'm taking you somewhere far from Milan. Just us, for 2 weeks. Somewhere with beaches and privacy and absolutely no business to attend to." "What about Sophia?" I asked, though the thought of 2 weeks alone with Matteo sent heat flooding through me. "Sophia," he said, with the confidence of someone who'd already planned everything, "will stay with my sister Isabella in Tuscany. She's been begging to spend time with her niece, and Sophia adores her cousins." His smile turned wicked. "Which leaves you entirely at my mercy for 14 uninterrupted days." "Mercy?" I raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you're calling it? Would you prefer I call it worship?" His voice dropped to that low register that never failed to affect me, because that's closer to what I have planned. Before I could respond, Sophia's voice called from the garden where she'd been playing with her art supplies. "Papa! Renata! Come see what I made!" We broke apart, sharing a look that promised continuation later, and walked hand in hand to where Sophia had arranged an elaborate display of drawings, her interpretation of our upcoming wedding, complete with flowers that defied botanical reality, and a sun that smiled down on stick figures she'd labeled in careful letters. "Papa, Renata, me." "It's beautiful, Piccola," Matteo said, kneeling to examine her work with the serious attention he'd learned to give her creative efforts. "Is that you in the middle?" "We're all holding hands," Sophia explained, pointing to the carefully drawn connections between figures. "Because families hold on to each other. Right, Renata?" I knelt beside Matteo, my hand finding his as we both looked at this child who'd taught us what family really meant. "Right, Tesoro. Families hold on to each other. Always." Sophia beamed, then threw her arms around both of us in a hug that squeezed my heart as tightly as her small arms squeezed our necks. Over her head, Matteo's eyes met mine, and I saw reflected there the same overwhelming gratitude and wonder I felt. We'd found each other through circumstances that should have been temporary. Employer and employee, father and nanny. 2 strangers connected only by responsibility to a child. Instead, we'd built something permanent, something real, something worth every wall demolished, every line crossed, every risk taken. As we held Sophia between us in the garden where so much had changed, where a little girl had learned to laugh again, and a father had learned to love without fear, I understood that the wedding would simply formalize what had already become truth. We were already a family. The ceremony would just let the rest of the world know. The morning of my wedding dawned with that particular quality of light that only early June in Milan could produce. Golden and soft, as if the sun itself was celebrating. I woke in my quarters for the last time, knowing that tonight I'd sleep in Matteo's room, in our room, no longer separated by hallways and propriety, but joined in every way that mattered. Elena, Matteo's sister, who'd arrived from Tuscany 3 days prior, knocked softly before entering with a breakfast tray and a smile that transformed her elegant features into something warm and conspiratorial. "The bride must eat," she announced, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "Isabella's orders. She says you'll faint during the ceremony if you don't, and then Matteo will blame himself for making you nervous, and the entire day will be ruined." I laughed, accepting the coffee she offered. "Is your brother nervous?" "Terrified," Elena said cheerfully. I found him in the garden at dawn, pacing like a caged animal. When I asked what was wrong, he said he couldn't believe you were actually going through with it. That surely you'd realize you deserved better than a man with his past. She settled into the chair across from me. "I told him that if you were foolish enough to run, I'd personally hunt you down and drag you back. Sophia needs you, and more importantly, my brother needs you." The casual acceptance in her voice, the way she'd embraced me as family without reservation, made my throat tight. "Thank you," I managed, "for welcoming me. I know this isn't the kind of marriage your family probably expected for Matteo." Elena's expression grew serious. "My family expected Matteo to marry someone appropriate. Someone from our world, with the right connections and background." She reached across to take my hand. "What we hoped for, what Julia would have wanted, was for him to marry someone who loved him and Sophia. Someone who saw past the power and reputation to the man beneath. You've given him back to himself, Renata. You've given Sophia her father. That's worth more than any advantageous alliance." 3 hours later, I stood before the mirror in a dress that had been created specifically for me. Ivory silk that flowed like water, simple and elegant with delicate lace sleeves, and a neckline that was modest but feminine. My hair was arranged in soft waves, held back with antique combs that had belonged to Matteo's mother. The emerald engagement ring caught the light, and around my neck was a new addition. A platinum pendant with 3 stones matching my ring. Matteo's gift that morning with a note. 3 hearts, 1 family, forever. And Sophia appeared in the doorway wearing a dress of pale green silk, her dark hair crowned with flowers, her eyes huge with excitement. "You look like a princess," she breathed. "A real one, not the ones in books." "And you," I said, kneeling carefully to avoid crushing my dress, "look like the most beautiful flower girl in the entire world." She giggled, then grew serious, her small hand touching my cheek in a gesture so like her father's, it made my heart clench. "You're not going to leave, are you? After the wedding? You'll really stay forever?" "Forever and ever," I promised, pulling her close. "You're stuck with me now, Tesoro." "Good," she whispered against my shoulder. "I want to be stuck with you." The ceremony was held in the garden, just as we'd planned. Chairs arranged in neat rows for the small gathering of close family and friends. An archway woven with roses and jasmine marking where we'd exchange vows, and Sophia's carefully planted bulbs now blooming in the rainbow pattern she'd designed months ago. As I walked down the makeshift aisle, Sophia leading the way, scattering flower petals with focused determination, Samuel offering his arm with the dignity of a man who'd become more father figure than employee. I had eyes only for Matteo. He stood beneath the floral arch, wearing a perfectly tailored suit, but it was his expression that stole my breath. No careful control, no practiced composure. Just raw, unguarded emotion as he watched me approach. Love and wonder, and something that looked almost like disbelief that this was really happening. When I reached him and Samuel placed my hand in his, Matteo's fingers trembled slightly against mine. "You came," he murmured, low enough that only I could hear. "Did you think I wouldn't?" I whispered back. "I've spent weeks terrified you'd realize what you were agreeing to," he admitted, his thumb tracing circles on my wrist in that habitual gesture. "That you'd understand you deserve someone better, someone whose past doesn't include blood and darkness." "I deserve someone who loves me and Sophia with everything he has," I said softly. "Someone who's brave enough to change, to build something better. I deserve you, Matteo. And you deserve happiness. So let's stop questioning it and just accept what we've found." His smile was brilliant, transformative. The smile I'd worked months to earn, and now got to keep forever. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of meaningful words and exchanged rings. Matteo's voice steady as he promised to love and cherish me, to protect our family, to build a future worthy of the faith I'd placed in him. My own vows caught in my throat. Emotion overwhelming carefully prepared words until I simply said what mattered most. "I love you. I love Sophia. I choose this life, this family, every single day, forever." When the priest pronounced us married and Matteo kissed me, tender and possessive and full of promise, Sophia's delighted cheer rang out above the applause, her pure joy infectious enough that soon everyone was laughing through happy tears. The reception flowed seamlessly from ceremony. Tables arranged in the garden, food that represented both Italian tradition and touches from my own Portuguese heritage, music that ranged from classical to contemporary as afternoon melted into evening. Sophia danced with everyone, her energy seemingly limitless, until Matteo swept her up and waltzed her around the makeshift dance floor with such tender focus that I had to look away before crying again. Later, much later, when the guests had departed and Sophia had finally surrendered to exhaustion, carried to bed by her father with her flower crown askew and a smile on her sleeping face, Matteo and I stood alone in the garden where everything had begun. "Mrs. Levi," he said, testing my new name. "How does it feel?" "Strange," I admitted. "Wonderful. Terrifying." "Right." I looked up at him, this man who'd been an enigma, then an employer, then a friend, and finally the love I'd never expected to find. "I'm yours now. Legally, officially, permanently." "You've been mine since you challenged Marta over dinner schedules," he corrected, pulling me close. "The ceremony just made it public." His lips found mine in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened. Months of restrained desire finally given free rein, now that we were truly, irrevocably bound. When we broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. "I have something to confess," he murmured. "What?" I asked, slightly breathless. "That night you confronted Marta, when you positioned yourself between her and Sophia without hesitation." He paused. "I fell in love with you in that moment, watching you defend my daughter like she was already yours. I knew then that I'd do whatever it took to make you part of our family permanently." "So this has all been an elaborate seduction?" I teased. "Months of courtship designed to trap me?" "Absolutely," he confirmed with complete seriousness. "Did it work?" "Completely," I admitted. "I'm thoroughly trapped. Whatever shall I do?" His smile was wicked. "I have a few suggestions, but they require privacy, a locked door, and the next several hours of uninterrupted time." Heat flooded through me at the promise in his voice, his eyes. "Then perhaps," I said, taking his hand, "we should retire to our room. Together. Permanently." "Permanently," he agreed, lacing his fingers through mine as we walked toward the house, toward our future, toward the life we'd built from broken pieces and unexpected love. Behind us, the garden stood silent, witness to all that had transpired within its borders. A child learning to laugh, a father learning to love without fear, a woman finding family in the last place she'd expected, and as Matteo swept me into his arms at the threshold of our bedroom, tradition honored even in this unconventional union, I looked into his eyes and saw reflected there the same truth I felt in every fiber of my being. This was where I belonged, where we all belonged. 3 hearts, 1 family, bound together by something stronger than obligation or circumstance, or even the vows we'd exchanged today, bound by choice, by love, by the fierce, unbreakable determination to protect what we'd found against anything that might threaten it.